Okay, all right. PG, why don't you go ahead and get started so we can stay on time here. All right, sorry, Peter, you're muted.
Good thing I turned my camera on so you could tell that I was talking without hearing anything. Thank you, Scott. And thank you all for coming and participating in these workshops. Personally, I found them to be quite rewarding in terms of I have learned a whole lot from the discussion that has gone on, and certainly the ideas that I've had have been changed and are continuing to change and evolve as we have these further discussions. So let me thank you all essentially for participating and for providing input into the process. What PG&E is going to do today, and let's go to the next slide, is we've got a couple of things that we would like to do in terms of objectives. One is to present a full slice of day proposal. Over these course of the workshops, over the last 6 workshops, we've spent time on sort of what the structure should be. We've spent time on counting rules. We've spent time on need determination and allocation. And so for the most part, what this recap workshop from PG&E's perspective is about is essentially pulling it all together and pulling it into a proposal that can then be discussed and talked about and thought about. We also, as I mentioned, I've learned a lot from this. I think PG&E has learned a lot from this. We acknowledge that the proposals are still evolving, and that essentially together as a group, we probably can make better decisions, or at least have dialogue to be able to get to a better design by having these workshops and having the discussions. So by all means, we're putting a proposal out there. But it is at this point suggested ways of looking at it and thinking about it. From PG&E's perspective, what we have learned and sort of where we are, I think we want to make sure that the whole thing fits together in terms of the design, the counting rules, the allocation, and that it makes sense and that it works to be able to provide and get to the incentives that the Commission has laid before us and charged us to consider. And again, as always, we're starting with those principles as the PUC laid them out in terms of balancing reliability with costs, balancing hourly sufficiency with advancing environmental goals, balancing granularity and meeting hourly needs with simplicity and transactability. And also, implementable in the 2024 timeframe. It looked like certainly the Commission would like to be able to implement this relatively quickly, and we think it needs to be somewhat of a complete package to be able to do that. And finally, to have it be durable so that whatever changes take place to the grid, that it can handle a good number of those changes without having to undergo a major overhaul as we are going through now. So, Luke, let's go to the next slide. In terms of the options and things that we have talked about and things that we are discussing, there are a number of different aspects of this. And we are basically laying out here sort of what some of the options are for these types of things. We've got it broken out by sort of proposal component and then sort of potential options. The slice structure, the season structure, and the showings. We talked about all of these sort of in the first couple of workshops. You can have different size slices in terms of the number of hours. You can have different seasons in terms of the number of months and showings. It could be sort of done on a monthly basis or a seasonal basis. All of those things are very much at the structure aspects of what the system should look like, and we've had discussions about those and the choices that are laid out there in terms of what some of the options are. Also, we talked about resource counting. We've got a lot of different methodologies. We currently use a mix of methodologies where we're using PMAX for some resources. We're using ELCC for other resources. We're using historic exceedance for even another set of resources. And the question to some degree is, we're doing that for a reason at this point. The question is how should we be doing things going forward, and how can we make it to be a little more consistent, or at least to be more pragmatic about sort of the way it works going forward. So, counting for wind and solar, there are different ways to do that. Hydro, the same way. Thermal, there are options with using a PMAX or with ambient D rates or using a UCAP. DR, there is the load impact protocols, which have been in place for a while and are very, very much focused on particular DR programs. There's also proposals for ELCC, and there are current discussions going on at the CEC workshop process about how DR should be counted. Storage is probably one of the more difficult ones. We have had some discussions. I am glad we're having a further discussion later in the week about storage, because I don't know that we've talked enough about storage and addressing some of the aspects of that. Certainly we're going to talk a little bit about where PG&E is on storage in this presentation, and sort of what our thinking is, and our thinking has evolved on this. Imports, hybrid resources. Hybrids are also another one of those types of resources that we need to be thinking about, and we don't have a whole lot of experience with, and so we need to give careful consideration on that. And then to some degree, there are actual, should we use a single NQC? Should we use multiple NQCs? How should it vary? How should the QCs vary in terms of what they are and how do they look? And charging requirements. Should the RA program have charging requirements for storage? As we get more and more storage on the system, and acknowledging the fact that storage is not a producer of energy, but a consumer of energy, to what degree does that need to be taken into account when we are setting up the program, and particularly as we get more and more storage on the system? Whether we should be using sort of for a load forecast. Should we be using a 1 in 2, a 1 in 5, a 1 in 10? Should we be basing it on gross load or net load? All of these things we have talked about. We have had some discussion about sort of what the pros and cons are of those, and sort of what the requirements should be set on. Should they be set on sort of the maximum hour values in terms of looking, or slice values in terms of looking at what the requirement which should be set at? Or should we be thinking about looking at a quote unquote worst day? That basically tries to identify how bad a particular day can get within the month or within the season, and be able to plan for that. Certainly LSE allocations, there is the current allocation. There is a bottom up where you basically build things up from the bottom. There's a top down where you currently basically, or you use essentially the system and you allocate by a single number. We'll be talking a bit about that as well. The PRM, there's options for PRM, unbundling, and both on the supply side in terms of resource unbundling and between slices, and then also on the load side in terms of requirements and allowing requirements to be traded between LSEs. So we're going to talk about all of these things and provide you with PG&E's proposal at this point. It is a straw proposal at this point, and we're going to explain a little bit what our thinking is behind each one of the pieces. We are certainly open for discussion and suggestions as to how things might be done, or might be done a bit differently than we're currently suggesting. So Luke, why don't we go to the next slide? And these are pretty much our recommendations, PG&E's recommendations, and we support basically a 24 slice type of framework, where each slice is 1 hour in duration, and that we do so on a monthly basis. And we'll essentially can do the showings either on a monthly basis. The requirements should probably still be based on monthly, but the seasonal the showings could be done on a seasonally, where you would be essentially showing multiple months per showing in a seasonal showing. Resource counting, we've talked about exceedance. We think exceedance is the right way to go for wind and solar. Also for hydro, we have an existing exceedance type of methodology that we have used. We think that should probably be continued, applied a bit differently. Thermal, we're proposing PMAX with ambient D rates. That's not to say that UCAP wouldn't work. I think we need to have a little more details about exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about how UCAP is calculated and what it does look like. We do have workshops on that in the future. And also, DR. The discussions at the CEC have been ongoing, and we know that that is taking place. We think it needs to be something like a LIP or a LIP-informed ELCC, something along those lines. But we'll talk more about sort of what the rationale is. For storage, storage is a bit tricky in terms of we've got a Pmax there, but what does that mean? We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the storage discussion in terms of how we're currently thinking about that. Imports, we think that needs to be on a contracted amount in terms of and shaped as it could be. Hybrid resources, we think also need some special attentions depending upon how we're doing storage and how we think about storage, along with essentially any excess energy that's going essentially directly to the grid from a hybrid resource. And non-dispatchable, we're pretty much thinking that an existing methodology should work. So in terms of the number of NQCs, it'll be somewhat resource dependent, and it's likely to be, you could essentially still have a production type of profile or a potential production profile where none of the values would change. If you think about existing gas-fired plants, you may not be changing the how much those could count per slice, but you would want to make sure that you would have, and so you would have essentially the same value. Is that one NQC or is that multiple NQCs? I guess the way I personally think about it is that's multiple NQCs, but it's the same value. Although you could also think about that as being one NQC. In terms of MCC buckets, we think we can eliminate MCC buckets. However, we have some concerns about DR and relying too much on DR for meeting requirements. And we can talk about that a little bit, largely because a lot of the DR programs have issues and the resources have issues with being available throughout the month or throughout the whole showing time frame. Charging requirements, yes, we are going to have charging requirements. We will talk about sort of how that works. Let's see, where am I now? Load forecast. We're going to stay with a 1 and 2, or recommend staying with a 1 and 2. That's what has been used across the proceedings for the most part for resource adequacy and IRP. We will note that for the most part, other proceedings use different values, and we could move to something else, but I think there needs to be further discussion about that. Gross load, I think gross load makes more sense given the complexity of calculating net load on an LSE basis, and that there would be, maximum hourly values would be setting the requirement in each of the months. LSE allocation, we would use the existing type of allocation but we would apply it on a slice basis. And it's our understanding that essentially the way we would do it, and we'll talk more about it, but the way we would do it is would recognize the differences between LSEs in terms of what their load shapes are. The PRM, we think that the PRM should be determined by an LOLE study based on sort of all the other parameters in terms of what the portfolio is, what the counting rules are, what the load forecast is, and essentially have that be done on a regular basis in terms of where it is. And finally, we're not at this point recommending unbundling either of slices or of requirements. And largely, this adds the unbundling adds a lot of complications. That's not to say that there wouldn't perhaps be the possibility of unbundling on the requirements side. It might be a little easier to do, but I don't know that necessarily can be easily baked in without adding more complexity to what we're thinking needs to be in place for 2024. So let's walk through each one of these and provide a little more detail about what our thinking is. So Luke, if we go to the next slide. In terms of the framework structure, in terms of slices, we are thinking that a 1 hour slice, so there would be 24 slices per typical day, is the right way to go about it. We think that there's been a large variation, or we've seen the large variation in renewable generation and the large variation to some degree in load, so that when you start putting hours together in a slice, you are essentially making assumptions about when and what resources are available. We also think it simplifies the resource counting by avoiding sort of mismatch for essentially storage and imports in terms of, oh, it's not coming in at exactly the right time. And so I think going to an hourly basis, or thinking about it on an hourly basis, provides more flexibility essentially for LSEs to be able to match what their load requirements are with resources. We think it's also a more durable framework because we won't have to be thinking about how to redefine slices and when and what the metric is to redefine slices, because we would already be doing things on an hourly basis. In terms of showing, that's the one thing that we have seen that might be problematic about going to such a diverse number of slices. We think, however, the Edison's tool demonstrates that it can be simplified in a way that would be workable both for LSEs on the showing side, as well as for the PUC and Energy Division on the compliance side. So that's what has sort of been the basis of our thinking behind slices. If we go to the next slide. In terms of seasons and showings, we're going to keep things on a monthly basis. We have done things on a monthly basis in California on the resource adequacy front. I think that is probably more in keeping with trying to make sure that we have the right type of resources on an operational basis, and that there is a lot of variation across the months in terms of resource availability in the past. And so what we're thinking is that we can continue with the monthly seasons in terms of monthly basis. It basically, anytime you think about moving from a monthly basis to a seasonal basis, you run into sort of the same problems we have with putting multiple hours in a slice, which is that the hours are not close enough, or I guess the question is, are the hours close enough in their characteristics? Both in the characteristics of what the load is, but also the characteristics of how the supply is operating in each of those months. And so from our perspective, we think it's easier and better to keep it on a 12-month basis and a 12-season basis. In terms of showings, showings can be done, the requirements should be done on a monthly basis. However, the showings essentially can be done either on a monthly basis or on a seasonal basis. There are pros and cons to each one of this. We're open to doing it on a seasonal basis. We note that there are some cons to doing that. People are used to doing it on a monthly basis. Given how much more complex the showings are going to be, it might make more sense to be moving to a seasonal. So from PG&E's perspective, we understand that there is the aspects and have some concerns, and are open to looking at either monthly or seasonal showings. Next slide, please. Resource counting. Resource counting for solar, wind, and dispatchable resources. We've seen essentially, if we're going to a 24 slice, looking at a 24 slice system, we think there are serious concerns about trying to apply an ELCC methodology or type of methodology to that type of a level. Personally, I find it very troubling that we even think about doing ELCC at a monthly basis, just given the parameters of the ELCC and how the analysis is done. But going to an hourly basis, we think is completely impractical, and we also think it's probably much better and much more easily reliable to rely on an exceedance basis. We think it's also less administratively burdened because you're essentially looking at historic data and historic profiles. Should these counting rules essentially be, at a regional level or at a resource level? I think that is open for discussion in terms of what's easiest to implement and how that could actually work. Of course, doing things at a resource basis is going to be more accurate. in terms of making sure that the resource is counting for what it's counting for, and that there isn't any sort of dilution in counting by grouping resources together. Certainly we think ELCC has its place, particularly in the IRP. We think it is very useful in determining what resource mix should be in the long run. We have trouble with it, though, thinking about it, how it should reflect operational availability in the monthly or RA timeframe. But we will acknowledge, for the most part, on the exceedance front, we think there's more analysis that needs to be done in terms of what is that exact exceedance level that makes sense and should be used. So that is something that we think needs more work and needs discussion. On dispatchable resources, we have recommended a PMAX with ambient D rates. That's we pretty much have a PMAX type of framework now. We see that at times with certain resources does not reflect ambient D rates. We think that the methodology should essentially reflect ambient D rates across all resources. We understand some resources do that already. We want to make sure that the resources are correctly accounting for what they can produce when in their availability. And if there are ambient D rates, that should be taken into account when that is set up. A U-type framework could also be adopted here, but we think it probably needs a little further development and a little further definition. And we're not quite sure how would all fit together, and we are open for discussion on this in essentially having that option. Let's move to the next slide. Let's see, storage. Let's see, this is my last slide, isn't it, Luke? Before I switch to you, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Storage. Storage, we have learned a lot about storage and a lot about thinking about storage. Largely, our thinking about storage needs to reflect, we have here reflector of resource PMAX and energy storage capacity. What do we mean by PMAX? And I guess what we mean by PMAX here is that there is probably a physical limit by which the storage resource essentially can discharge to the grid. It's that physical limit, and it may be encumbered by the interconnection limit. But essentially a PMAX to some degree under the current definition it basically has a 4-hour implication. What we're thinking, though, is that what a storage device should be able to account for is sort of what their maximum physical output could be in an hourly period, and it would be limited essentially by the total limitation across the number of hours in the day would be limited by the energy limits. What do I mean by that? That if you've got that essentially, if you can discharge your entire resource within 1 hour and use up your entire storage capacity or sort of energy capacity, then that would be possible. But it would also allow you to use it in any way, or the resource essentially to use it in any way that it could within those defined parameters in terms of what its maximum output could be, as well as sort of what its energy limitation could be. There are some concerns, and we understand, we certainly heard this morning, there were concerns about about cycling and multi-cycling per day and whether that can count. I guess we need to have some more discussion about that. We hear the ISO's concern about that. We also have concerns about, okay, it's going to add a lot more complexity to make sure that operationally, or at least to think about how we're counting for things, because even if we've got a storage resource that could cycle multiple times a day, we need to make sure that there is the time in between those cycles essentially to be able to recharge and to essentially to be able to make that subsequent output. And it's not 100% clear to us in terms of exactly what those requirements would be. We're looking forward to this being addressed by the storage parties on Friday to essentially provide examples of how multi-cycle storage would be working in this type of a framework. And that's not to say that it couldn't happen. It's just that we're not sure how it would work or what it looks like. You know, we hear the ISO's concern about wanting to keep things to single cycle, and at this point that makes some sense to us. But we're open to discussion and open to talk on that. So the other thing with storage is that we'll also have a requirement that the LSCs that are using storage will have to basically show that they have enough capacity to be able to charge that storage in other hours for which they're not counting the storage. And so that requirement, I think, is very important, because we don't currently have that. And as we get more and more storage on the system, it's likely to be a bigger issue. And so that's sort of what our thinking is about storage. Let me turn it over to Luke. I see that there are a number of hands and questions coming up in the chat. We're hoping basically to get through our entire presentation before taking questions. So let me turn it over to Luke, and we will move on from there.
All right, thanks, Peter. I will try to go quickly through the remaining slides. Okay, so still on resource counting. Hybrid. So our recommendation on hybrid is to maintain something very similar to the existing methodology. And kind of based on the survey results that were presented earlier, I think there might be some confusion about what the existing methodology does. But basically, it tests to see if there's sufficient charging capability from the renewables to fully charge the battery. And then if there is sufficient capacity, it kind of subtracts that off and then applies an ELCC to the remainder. So kind of at the highest level, I think our recommendation is let's keep that existing methodology. It's already in place. You know, we've gone through like several workshops and decisions to kind of put that methodology into place. But let's just make some small tweaks to it. Maybe the biggest one, which is that you would be applying an exceedance to the remaining renewables instead of an ELCC, and that would be consistent with how standalone renewables are applied under this type of a framework. There's probably a couple of other small tweaks in there as well. I think the profile that's used to determine if there's a sufficient charging capacity, I think that uses something similar to an exceedance today. You would certainly want to align that with whatever exceedance level you choose for solar or wind. And then there's probably some special provisions that need to be put in place for cases in which there isn't sufficient renewable capacity to fully charge the storage. In our view, it's administratively simple and doesn't require large-scale methodology changes. So it's kind of an approach that we think is viable in the 2024 timeframe. In terms of hydro, so we have recently adopted exceedance methodology for hydro. It was good to see in the survey results that seem to be kind of broad support for maintaining that. That methodology does give additional weight for hydro years, and it could be easily adapted to the kind of hourly 24 kind of hour type framework, where you're applying it for the full 24 hours instead of just the gross peak. Imports. So kind of two categories of imports: resource specific. Those could use the updated counting rules. So for instance, if it's a solar resource that's being imported, it would use kind of the updated exceedance approach that we've been discussing. For the non-resource specific, we're suggesting that these continue to be counted at the contract value. Still subject to the RO requirement that resources be at least 4 hours. And there was discussion about that earlier in the workshop today. Okay, so non-dispatchable and demand response. So non-dispatchable, we think the current NQC methodology could be continued here, just adapted to hourly values. For demand response, we have here kind of a ELCC/LIP. You could also put in there like LIP informed ELCC. I mean, essentially, we're kind of deferring to the CEC, the ongoing CEC process for demand response. In our view, the RA reform initiative, we just don't have the bandwidth to go through and do kind of a full study of DR and what values should be used there. And so, we think at least to start the CEC process and kind of what that generates should be used. Kind of the last bullet here, multi-day reliability. This is a concern for demand response. We will talk about this a little bit later. We think that this could potentially be addressed by maintaining a demand response cap. Okay, values. So this is the question of whether there should be one value, two values, like 24 values. I think in our view, there's probably a need for a table that's kind of broadly available that people can trade against that essentially has 24 entries per month, for each resource, and that would essentially facilitate both variable resources where it's likely that the resource has a different value in every hour, and as well as static resources, because a static resource could just essentially have the same value for every hour of that 24-hour table. And so, in our view, this is kind of a simple solution to this issue, and would help facilitate just the transparency into what resources are worth, enable LSEs to kind of use it to plan, kind of transact, as well as plan for showings, etc. Okay, so MCC buckets. So we're recommending that under the 24 slice approach that we could essentially eliminate the MCC buckets, with the one potential exception for some kind of cap on demand response. And as I mentioned, the multi-day reliability could potentially present problems for demand response. A couple of examples being, call limitations. If you have an event that lasts, several days and you're unable to call DR across all of those days. And then also just general customer fatigue. And I think we know that, customers stop responding if you call them too much. And so applying a cap on demand response could, help ensure that the system does not rely too much on DR during these prolonged events. So requirements. So a few different things here on requirements. The first is kind of this question of max hourly value versus worst day. We're recommending using the max hourly approach. This just ensures that you don't have any kind of unexpected reliability events because we're using kind of the values from a worst day in the forecast. And maybe let me just step back and kind of describe the difference here. So under a max hourly value approach, you would look at each hour and in the forecast for that particular month, and you would take the maximum value in that hour. And so you'd be kind of creating you'd be creating kind of an artificial worst day. Whereas the worst day approach is finding the maximum value in the month, regardless of the hour, and then using the 24 hours within that day. And when we looked at the CEC forecast, we found some cases in which the worst day didn't correspond to kind of the worst value in certain hours. And so in our view, it doesn't make any sense to kind of take a risk there. That we should essentially just use the max value approach. Load forecasting, gross load, it seemed like there was based on the survey results that we saw earlier, it seemed that there was pretty strong alignment that gross load should be used. We think it resolves a lot of the issues that potentially come up with using a net load approach, including kind of facilitating the renewable transactions that could be problematic if you move to a net load approach. And then 1 and 2, I think our view is 1 and 2 presents the greatest likelihood of being implemented by 2024, and so starting with this makes sense. PRM recommendation. So doing loss of load analysis, it's critical of selecting the PRM. We think it should be kind of the level of reliability should be determined by the CPUC, and that we should kind of lock in the other framework elements prior to doing that analysis and determining what that PRM should be. We also think there needs to be kind of a regular update process that's put in place to ensure grid conditions don't change such that we need to have a different PRM. Unbundling. So we have here no unbundling of slices or requirements. And there was some discussion earlier about some of the issues with unbundling. We have some of those listed here. For instance, just the administrative complexity of trying to track them. There are tools like swaps that can be used to kind of address some of those imbalances. And then we have a couple additional ones here, which I'm going to jump to that last bullet, which is the slice of day as improvement over the existing system. I think in our view, slice of day much more closely aligns with an LSC's particular load over kind of the existing system, which you're essentially required to build or buy resources in prescribed hours, even if it doesn't match your load well in other hours. And then the last one, the second bullet here, which is the greater penetration of storage, will diminish the need for bundling. In this system, storage is a very modular resource that can easily fill gaps. And so as we continue to build out additional storage, it's going to become less and less critical to unbundle, or kind of to put it another way, the rationale for unbundling becomes less and less compelling as you have greater levels of storage, because you can use that as a resource to fill in those gaps instead of in an unbundling framework going out and just buying a resource for a couple of hours. So on the requirements side, so similar issues to those that we just discussed. In addition, there's, to be honest, we haven't really thought much about unbundling on the requirements side, but just kind of the thought of it kind of presents questions for us, like, what does it mean to serve load if you can just trade that requirement away? And then it also kind of raises questions about, is it just RA that you're trading, or should there be other attributes that are included there as well, like emissions and RPS? Okay, and then our last slide is on the allocation. We're pretty consistent here with what SCE described earlier. We believe the existing SCEC process could be adaptable with the slice of day structure. They already kind of produce and allocate requirements at the gross load level, and they've kind of indicated a willingness to investigate a similar process at the slice level. And so in our view, we should go forward and test this out and see if it works prior to looking for other alternatives. Okay, and with that, I'll go ahead and stop, and we'll go to questions.
first person in the queue is Doug.
Oh, actually, that was, I had it up earlier. I don't have a question. Thanks.
Okay, so then we have Barbara.
Right. Now, Peter, you know I'm going to ask this question. You made the statement that ELCC is not practical for wind or solar on a 24-hour basis, and that it's problematic even on a monthly basis, with which I absolutely agree. Why does it make sense then to consider using it for demand response, which has exactly the same 24-hour monthly issue? And you can defer that to your demand response people if you want to, but it's a point I wanted to make.
No, I understand, Barbara, and sort of from personally from my perspective, and it's not necessarily from PG&E's perspective, that when you start getting to shorter and shorter periods of time for which you're using ELCC, it becomes more problematic. In the IRP type of framework where you're looking at an entire year and you're looking at sort of what the portfolio should be for that entire year to meet the projected load in that year, it makes a lot more sense to be using an ELCC type of framework. The discussions at the CEC are ongoing. There are operational aspects that are influencing those discussions. And let me, the point is taken though, Barbara. I understand that there are issues with using ELCC for various types of resources.
Thank you. And then I just want to make one additional point briefly. In the CEC process, the Energy Commission has proposed not even to consider the connection of DR to slice of day until the second half of next year, which I think raises some serious timing problems for implementability for 2024 that I just think everybody should be aware of. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Barbara, I certainly am aware of the fact that the DR cycle is a longer cycle, and lining things up for changes is often challenging.
Okay, next in the queue is me. So I have a couple of questions. The first one, since it sounds like PG&E is a little ambivalent about the need for monthly showings, so I'll go ahead and ask it. Which is, I'm having a hard time understanding. I agree that showing these 24-hour slice requirements adds a lot of data and process work that both LSEs and Energy Division staff will need to undertake. And so I'm just struggling to understand the value of monthly showings. If you have the worst day is based on a September day, and an LSE shows that it has adequate capacity to meet its requirements in September, and that same capacity is under contract for June, July, and August. And what value do we get in requiring the LSEs to actually go through the work of showing that they also have adequate capacity for June, July, and August?
I guess, Scott, the assumption you're making, I think, is that the same capacity is available, that is under contract for all of those months, is one of the assumptions that I think you're making. You're also making the assumption that when the resources are available in June, July, and August are when they'll be available also in September or October or later periods. And I think demonstrably, that's not going to be the case, particularly if we're setting requirements on an hourly basis for each month on an hourly basis. Now, so seasonal, what I mean by seasonal showings is that it's the filing to the PUC that is done on a seasonal basis. The requirements would still be determined on a monthly basis, and would change, essentially be different between June, July, between each of the months, June, July, August, and September. And also the counting could be different between those months.
Yeah, on that first point you said about my assumption of the resources being under contract, in my mind, that would be a condition. So if the season is 3 months, the contract would need to be 3 months, but you would still basically show that your resources are adequate on the worst day of that 3-month season. And
that would be, and Scott, that would be the case if the requirements were set for all 3 months based on a single requirement. But
Yeah.
but essentially what we're saying to some degree is we think that there's enough problems with setting the requirements on a seasonal basis to basically want to set the requirements on a monthly basis. And then it's just a question of, okay, if the requirements are on a monthly basis, when do you have to show to the PUC? It could simply just be an annual showing. It could be once for all 12 months. The requirements would still essentially be set on a monthly basis, but the showing could be essentially on an annual basis. There are pros and cons with sort of separating the showing from essentially what the requirements are, particularly with the requirements changing, the fact that we generally don't know what's going to happen in the future, even in the next 2 or 3 months, and it might be easier to have more flexibility by having the showings on a monthly basis.
Yeah. Okay. And then the second question I have is just, and apologies if this was covered before in one of the resource counting workshops, but I don't recall the specific aspect of using exceedance. But how do you capture synergistic or antagonistic effects where different resources have these combined either benefits or detriments, which ELCC can capture? I think it's not insurmountable for exceedance. I just haven't heard it addressed. Do you have any thoughts on that?
The question to some degree is, are resources acting together to be able to provide either an incentive or a disincentive for reliability? And you are correct that what we're talking about and thinking about essentially is saying, now each resource needs to be able to show what it can provide in each slice to be able to meet load in that slice, regardless of what other resources are how other resources are acting in that slice. So you're correct that the exceedance type of methodology does not necessarily acknowledge any sort of benefits from being paired with another type of resource, but for essentially hybrid resources, is exactly where we're putting them together in looking at that. And the question to some degree is, how much should we attribute to some of the synergistic aspects, and how much should that be counted on in providing reliability, rather than putting it down to essentially what the resource is that can produce to be able to provide energy in that period.
I'll just add as well, I think it was the second resource counting workshop, so we had presented an approach to kind of a methodology for selecting a particular exceedance level, right? And that involved looking at where we're kind of the peak days of the last 5 years or so, and then what exceedance level kind of corresponds with the production in those days, which I think is one way to try to get it. What are you actually seeing when the grid is stressed? And I know there were some comments from that workshop suggesting, well, maybe the peak day isn't actually the most stressed day. We're certainly open to kind of other thoughts there. And then I think the solar parties also presented an approach that would look at you would kind of still use ELCC, but you would use it as a way to kind of calibrate the exceedance level that you choose for wind and solar. And so those might be two different options that we think are worth kind of considering going forward as we're trying to sort out what the appropriate exceedance level is.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that we're not potentially losing portfolio diversity benefits. All right, but we should move on because there are other people with questions. So the next in the queue is Luke.
Damn it. Hello?
Yes, Luke, go ahead.
Oh, good. Sorry, I was having problems there. Luke Tugis from the California Efficiency and Demand Management Council. Question for Luke, I believe. So with regard to the DR cap, I understand the arguments or the thoughts behind the possibility of retaining the DR cap, that you've laid out there a little bit. But one scenario I'm thinking of though is maybe a certain DR that's maybe backed by energy storage, for instance, and for which there would be no issue of customer fatigue or something like that. And so one thought I would ask you for you to consider is maybe if there is a DR cap, then it would only be applied to maybe a DR that's not backed by energy storage. And then I have two quick questions. One is with regard to a DR cap, have you considered how that would work under this proposal? For instance, would it be applied for each slice? I assume that would be the case, and would it be the same? Would the cap be the same for each slice, each of the 24 slices?
Yeah, Luke, thanks for the questions. So on the second one, we haven't actually thought that far ahead. So it is a good point that you're raising. I think we'll have to think about it more, and we'll have to kind of take it back to our DR staff to talk with them about if there is a cap, how fast would we implement it. And also, thanks for pointing out the storage back DR. That's something that we certainly could consider as well.
Yeah, I mean, Luke, those are both things that we haven't gotten to the level of detail yet in the thinking, and are subject to basically being persuaded to do things one way or another.
Yeah. Okay. Appreciate that. And then one final thing, you don't need to necessarily respond, but something that I would just also suggest that you consider is how that DR cap would be determined, and how that headroom will be allocated. So would it be allocated to utility DR first, or would it be allocated to third-party DR first, or would it be some sort of equal allocation?
No, those are good points, Luke, and we haven't gotten to that level of detail. But those are good things that need to be brought into consideration with this.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, then we have Paul.
Hi, this is Paul Nelson on behalf of CLECA, and I'm not going to ask a DR question. It's actually the max hourly load value versus I think it's worst day on slide 13. So if I just let me make sure I understand. So your max hourly value approach is to sort of take the max hourly value in each month to sort of create a synthetic load shape, which I'm assuming is also higher than what you would do if you picked the worst day. And so, is that right?
It would be higher in certain hours.
Correct.
But it would also depend on the month too.
Right. So it's not really then quite the 1 and 2, is it?
I'm not. Well, we're using a 1 and 2 load forecast.
Yeah, but we have
so,
this synthetic load shape that picks all the maximums because it's a synthetic shape, and I'm not sure exactly in terms of like a 1 and 2 or probabilistic what it now represents anymore.
I guess the way we think about it, or the way I think about it, Paul, is that we're taking the 1 and 2 load forecast as the basis for which we then look at the maximum values in each of the hours.
Yeah, but it seems to me like this technique is now starting to overlap with some of the things that the planning reserve margin does, which embeds load forecast error. So if you're going to back into a PRM, then how you treat max or worst load shape would influence your selected PRM.
As would a number of the other parameters, including
Right.
sort of how we're counting resources. No,
Right.
I mean that's a good point, Paul. Is that sort of the way we're setting what the requirements are and how we're meeting those requirements will have an impact on what the PRM is.
Yeah.
And the level of the PRM, and that's true sort of how you set the load forecast, but also how you count resources as well.
Yeah. It's adding another issue of complexity to this, and of course, customers want reliability, but they don't want to overpay for the reliability either. So it's a tricky situation here. But yeah, I think give me some thought to that. I think as you develop your recommendations here, it would be helpful.
Okay, yeah, I don't know that I agree that it adds an additional layer of complexity, because it's not that much different to pull out the maximum hourly values as it is to pull out the values in kind of the worst day. But
let me clarify. I think it adds a layer of complexity in trying to figure out what's the right PRM when you've created this synthetic load shape that people are going to create a resource stack to meet.
Yeah, and I guess, Paul, you're getting at sort of how the PRM is determined. And I guess certainly the way we've been thinking about it is that the PRM would be determined on an iterative basis. Yeah. That you would essentially look at sort of what the resource counting is and what the load forecast is. You would essentially run that value of meeting those requirements against essentially your LOLE analysis with a PRM with a target, with a sort of a dummy PRM, and then essentially you would adjust your PRM either up or down given the level of load that you would have, and then you would rerun it on an iterative basis until you get to the.
But I'm assuming when you do the PRM, you're running the actual 1 and 2 load shapes, not the synthetic load shapes.
Well, no,
the synthetic load shapes are the target.
Paul, wait a second. With the LOLE analysis, you're not running it against a single load forecast. You're running it against all potential loads that are in the distribution in that forecast, which is represented by the 1 and 2. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, I see what you're saying. Okay. All right. Thanks, Peter. That was helpful.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. Let's see if we can squeeze in another couple questions. We have David. There's no last name given.
Hello, David.
Okay, David, give me another couple seconds here to respond. You're online. Okay, and then next in the queue was somebody calling in with no name identified, calling in from an 805-433 number.
David's back. We give him a moment.
Okay, David, why don't you go ahead?
It's David McMillan with Megawatt Storage. Sorry about that problem. It's not clear to me that a single load profile as proposed under the both the SE and this proposal, and which is targeting specifically trying to figure out how many resources you need to hit the worst case load. It's not clear to me that that load profile is also simultaneously going to identify the worst case charging scenario for storage. Like I could envision the worst case load being a heat wave across the West with low wind output and high air conditioning. And I could see in contrast, the worst case battery storage charging scenario might be a period like this week where we have an atmospheric river. It's giving widespread cold, cloudy weather. So we have low solar output and we have short winter days. And so I'm wondering, is there some kind of mathematical calculation or other evidence that a single load profile can do this double duty of identifying both the worst case storage charging situation and the worst case load? And I think part of the complexity of this is historically, when everything was dispatchable, you could basically look at a single hour and say, what's my worst case hour? And do I have enough resources if I stack it to meet it? But with storage, we're doing time shifting. And so now you've introduced time as an additional dimension. And you're now heavily dependent for your storage resources, which are going to be significant on the grid, on the cumulative previous history. And so that's a significantly more complex simulation or modeling challenge.
Yeah, David, I guess what you're pointing to is that and to what degree is the load forecast that the CEC putting into place going to be reflective of the charging that will be required by the resources that we'll need in later load shifts? To the extent that the load forecast takes that into account explicitly, then you may well have a reflection, a better reflection of essentially difficulties of perhaps charging. And you're right in that the question is, the problem will be changing over time, and it won't necessarily be the highest load. But the point to some degree is well, what's happening with that demand? The storage demand puts on the system, and is that being taken into account in some of the load forecasts?
I'll just add, I think so the example with the winter charging issues, I think that just underscores the importance of, selecting the exceedance, the kind of appropriate exceedance value, right? And so you could, if that's a major concern, you could, potentially have a higher exceedance value in the winter months to ensure that you have sufficient renewable output, to charge those resources in those months.
Yeah, and you have to be a little bit careful just looking at the seasonal variation, because you also get differences of output with respect to the output of renewables in different seasons and the hydro availability and so forth. Okay.
Okay. There were two more people. We're going to ask them to hold their questions until the final Q&A session. Why don't we go ahead and let NRDC go ahead and queue up their presentation?
Thanks very much, Scott. And let me just get my presentation teed up here. All right, can folks see my presentation screen share here?
Yes.
Peter. All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. Nick Pappas, I'm a consultant to the Natural Resources Defense Council. Thanks again for having us back on the agenda here today. What I'm going to present is going to be fairly quick. This is not a proposal. This is really in the vein of the sort of survey component of the day, indicating where parties have landed. So my present today is actually on behalf of a small coalition we've pulled together of like-minded parties interested in the 24 one-hour monthly framework that originally was just put forth by SEE, but as we've been pleasantly surprised today, has now been endorsed in concept by both Edison and PG&E. So with me in this coalition, with NRDC in this coalition, we have CERT, Vote Solar, SEIA, the American Clean Power Association, as well as the California Efficiency and Demand Management Council and Southern California Edison, who we heard from earlier today. So as a group, we have been meeting over the last couple of weeks to discuss our shared interest in the evolution of the RA program and some of the benefits that we see from the hourly framework that Edison has put forward, particularly in facilitating a new structure that will support preferred resources, meaningful participation in the RA program commensurate with their benefits. So at a high level, we have endorsed the structural framework that Edison has put forward. The hour monthly approach is the best path forward to ensure reliability, maximize preferred resource participation in the RA program, as well as properly aligned reliability incentives for LSEs. I'm going to perhaps skip over the depth here. Folks can see this in the deck that was circulated, and a lot of this has been covered in concept by Edison and PG&E in their presentations. I do want to highlight that as a coalition, we are not endorsing sort of every detail layer that has been put forward by either Edison or PG&E, but we are endorsing the hourly framework as the best path forward, sort of in the spirit of nailing down some of these degrees of freedom and moving into this calibration process over the next couple of months. So at a high level, I'll touch on just a couple of points here. We support the hourly month-hour framework. We support Edison's proposal for a single monthly showing rather than 24 hourly showings. We are not supporting or we're not endorsing any specific changes to the must offer structure. This retains the sort of competitive economic dispatch that CAISO currently operates and the obligations RA resources have in that space. In terms of resource counting at a high level, we're endorsing the essentially the exceedance-based methodology or some month-hour profile-based methodology that Edison and PG&E have put forward, where we assign renewable resources month-hour profiles commensurate with their expected availability. We believe this will improve transparency and accessibility for stakeholders, create much greater opportunities for consideration of technological and geographical differentiation. And also, we would like to see a sort of smooth transition from the current QC accounting rules to this new framework. So I'm seeing some chats. No, this is not a proposal. This is a set of coalition principles in support of the kind of correlation homework exercise that was discussed around the survey this morning to help illustrate where a number of environmental and renewable parties have landed. We also endorse the general framework around storage and demand response, allowing those resources to be allocated efficiently across their hourly slices, and then at a high level endorse conventional resource counting to occur commensurate with their characteristics without endorsing any specific framework across the coalition. We also believe that using LSE-specific load shapes, as Edison has discussed around the CEC's presentation, makes the most sense, and that we should use an annual or biennial process to update the PRM using an LLE process. So finally, we see this as a critical bridge between the IRP and the RA programs, and could see this as a very valuable tool in the IRP process to think about LSE-specific positions and contributions to reliability needs. And very important to this group is to maintain transactability as a core principle of the RA program. So as discussed in the Edison proposal, we believe that the relevant slices should be bundled. We will maintain the ability to have products be transacted between resources, between LSEs, effectively in the same sort of monthly pro rata share structure that we have today. And then finally, we want to ensure as part of this transition, we're respectful of the terms of PPAs between power suppliers and LSEs for existing and pending contracts. So I'm going to pause there and see if anyone else from the coalition has anything to share before we move forward. And if not, happy to pivot to Q&A and sort of more broadly pivot to Q&A around the three proposals, or excuse me, now two proposals. Oh, and actually, I apologize. We do have one more point on next steps. So as has been discussed today, we're, as a coalition, very excited to dive into this next phase once we can get a general framework laid out to dive deeper into some of the deeper refinements and both qualitative and quantitative calibration of the program, as well as start testing some actual quantitative parameters. I'll invite Rick O'Connell, if you want to say a few words about Grid Lab's efforts there, feel free to jump in.
Sure, thanks, Nick. Yeah, so Grid Lab is representing CERT in this proceeding, but in this particular case, we're developing a tool or funding the development of a tool that's going to make, I think there's been a lot of discussion around resource accreditation and exceedance in different ways to think about specifically variable resources, wind and solar. And we're developing a tool that's going to be transparent that we're going to make available to all parties, that's going to help benchmark those choices to a more traditional LOLE study. So people can sort of see quickly without having to do complicated studies or ask, expensive consultants to do studies that take a long time, to be able to look at the different trade-offs between the resource accreditation choices. So we should be making that tool available hopefully early next year. I have a draft of it already, but we're just going to get the bugs worked out.
Great, thanks very much, Rick. And I saw a question in the chat about the deck. So this was circulated by PG&E yesterday, and appreciate PG&E recirculating this. We had some last minute sign-ons that we wanted to add, and weren't able to meet the Monday deadline. So this should be out to the service list. So with that, happy to move into Q&A unless anyone else from the coalition wants to make any comments.
Okay, well, I see that, and these were hands up that were still up from the previous presentation from PG&E at the end. So, but I guess I'll respect that cue. So Noah, you had your hand up.
Hey, this is Noah Tom from Middleware Power. And Scott, let me know if this is more appropriate for the later Q&A session, sort of more general. My question at the time for PG&E was, is in their mind whether or not on the PRM timing, when they were thinking of sort of having that discussion or requiring that discussion to be had to make a determination, so that the framework can be implemented in 2024. And this
Yeah, I think that might be.
Folks, as on both Gridwell as well as Edison.
Yeah, I think that might be a good question for the entire panel.
Okay, I'll defer the question. Thanks.
And then there was still this person calling in from an 805 number. You have your hand up.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, this is Alan Meck from San Diego Gas and Electric. I wanted to respond further to Scott's question about why we should prefer the monthly showing and have 12 seasons as opposed to trying to group months together. I don't think that these two additional considerations I heard, I don't think I heard these provided. But so the first thing that I would say that the monthly showing provides as a benefit is that there is the risk of over procurement, similar to the same risk that that SCE demonstrated, and why we should prefer 24-hourly slices. You run into the same problem with doing seasonal showings. If you try and group June, for example, in with the rest of summer, then you end up having to procure to, let's say that your highest load is in August. Well, then you have to procure that level of resources for 4 months of the year, August, September, and also July and June. And it's not as big of an over procurement problem. My back of the envelope calculation, and it's very rough, but my back of the envelope calculation was you come up with about an extra 3% of extra resources that you have to procure over what you would normally have to procure. But it's a consideration. I think that it's an unnecessary extra 3% that you shouldn't have to procure necessarily. The other reason that I think that we should prefer the monthly showings is that you start to run into a forecasting problem. Right now we do our monthly showings 45 days out, and that's probably okay. But if you start doing a seasonal showing, let's say like 3 months in a season, then you're having to show like 135 days out, and forecasting might become a bit more problematic in that sort of situation. So those are the two things I wanted to put on the table. Open to hearing other folks' thoughts, though. All right, I'll stop now.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that additional information, Alan. Okay, and then the next person in the queue was Partha.
No, thank you. This is Partha Malavadkar from the California ISO. Nick, really appreciate your presentation. I just had one clarifying question. Do you mind going back to the previous slide? Sorry, one more. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's perfect. When you're referring to the framework being a 24 1-hour slice framework, but the showings being a single monthly showing of resources, not a 24 showing, how are you thinking about that being operationalized? Is there basically, in effect, 2 levels of checks where there's sort of a CPUC level check on 24 basically energy values to fill in, as well as sort of a separate process around sort of a single capacity value?
Yeah, Partha, I think there's maybe a couple different answers to that, and I'll start with a couple and see if Edison wants to jump in, because I think they've developed the CAISO connection probably deeper than I have. But I think at a high level, I'm thinking of this as similar to the MCC bucket framework, which is that the commission has its hourly test or an MCC testing, and that is sort of separate from what the resource actually, has as a must-offer obligation to the CAISO. In this case, we have characteristics, a profile that's used to generate LSC-specific tests, and this as a framework is not modifying specifically how those resources are shown or operationalized by CAISO. I know there's been discussion of potentially modifications to sort of align this between the CAISO and CPUC systems, but I'll defer that to Brent and Jeff here, because I have not been involved at the same level in the discussions about how to kind of align across the agencies.
Sorry, this is Brent. I was waiting for Jeff to jump in. But yeah, so the expectations of CPU, at least unless the tariff changes, the CPUC can check what they need to. In this case, the 24-hour or 24 slice proposal is to check all slices, make sure resources are counted within their capabilities, and that there's excess capacity brought to cover storage. As far as what the connection between the CPUC process and the CAISO process, that the shape for a solar resource, and this is kind of hit this in the chat a little bit and maybe in the presentation earlier, is we kind of expect for solar resources that whatever is deemed deliverable on the peak today would be that single number, and then there'd be a corresponding shape to translate that single number into kind of expected capacity in each hour. And so that's a way we can bridge the kind of current world to this future world. And CAISO can still maintain its single hour check, gross peak, whatever corresponds to that kind of deliverable amount.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks, Nick and Brent. While I have you, Brent, I was going to ask a question earlier of SCE, and was on a similar vein. And so we've been thinking about sort of different ways that we can sort of best harmonize the CAISO's program with the CPUCs under these different methodologies, and sort of some of the key aspects were sort of the questions that you're asking now, and maybe to one of your earlier points, I think you had suggested that backstop capacity would be assigned to LSCs based on their deficiency in the CPUC arena. Are you basically suggesting that the CAISO would basically use the CPUC process, or is it basically that we would need to have an internal process that produced sort of a consistent outcome on our end?
Yeah, so whether that's information transmitted from the CPUC to CAISO, or CAISO running the CPUC's tool to double check the showing, the 24-hour showing, I don't have a strong position on that. Probably something that could be determined later.
No, that's helpful. Yep. Thanks again. Appreciate it.
Great. I think, Scott, that probably wraps up Q&A for us, and I think we have a very lively Q&A on the two proposals after this. So I'll hand it back unless there's anybody else here.
No, that's it. So yeah, now if you would like to join the queue to ask questions to any of the presenters from today, please go ahead and do so. All right, and I see Julia, you have your hand up.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks, Nick, for your presentation. This kind of bridges your presentation with the others. So I was just taking all the updates from everyone and thinking about, okay, so Edison's looking at hourly exceedance and ELCC yearly. PG&E is looking at exceedance and PMAX, not using ELCC, and Gridwell's using ELCC yearly. Am I capturing that right?
So this is Brent from SE. So SE is not suggesting anything to do with ELCC, at least the current formulation of ELCC.
So with the presentation Nick just gave that adds in the ELCC importance, does that, or am I missing something?
Julia, this is Nick. Let me jump in. I think there may be some confusion, and I I'm not sure if this was on our slide. If so, it was an error, but we're not endorsing ELCC. And I think particularly from the perspective of storage resources related to the discussion earlier today, there's a lot of value from looking at hourly slices in terms of being to allocate the counting of those across hours, whether it's 4, 8, 12, whatever, and being able to fill the actual LSE gaps. And that would not have ELCC or exceedance. That would be based on the storage resource counting. But the energy to charge those resources, to the extent it's coming from variable energy resources, would use exceedance or some other statistical measure to get what we expect as a month-hour profile from particularly solar and wind.
Okay, thanks for that clarity. Appreciate it.
There are actually no other hands up. Okay, there we go. And there were quite a few people who had still had hands up right before lunch. So if you'd like to go ahead, if you still have questions left, if you'd like to go ahead and get back in the queue.
This is Carrie Scott. There were some questions asked in the chat that I'd be happy to respond to. I had to drop off, so I wasn't able to respond to them all, but I could certainly do that verbally after Noah's question.
Okay, yeah, why don't we do that? So Noah, why don't you go ahead, and then we'll just give Carrie a chance to verbally go over some of those questions that were directed to her.
Yeah, thanks for that. This is Noah from Middle River Power. Just sort of asking the question to both Edison, PG&E, and Gridwell. Is there, in your minds, procedurally, with your proposals, or just the two versions of the proposals on 24 slices versus 2 slices now, have you guys given thought on where the commission would need to sort of land, make its determination, and then proceed with a PRM analysis? Because the PRM, as sort of Peter said, is based on the inputs that are decided as part of this framework, and trying to better understand whether or not we're able to give the commission the facts around what is part of this entire framework as we bring everything together.
Yeah, no, let me speak to that from PG&E's perspective. I think from our perspective, the parameters of the program need to be established essentially before the LOLE analysis can be done. And why is that the case? Well, because of the fact that the parameters, just for the most part, of the program, which essentially are how are the requirements set, what is the structure of those requirements, what are resources going to count, and how are the resources going to count, essentially go into determining exactly how many resources are needed to be able to meet those requirements. And it's that set of resources essentially needed to meet those requirements essentially that can then be used in the LOLE analysis to be able to look at what the PRM is. So from PG&E's perspective, there needs to be a decision on all of the inputs that would go into and influence essentially the LOLE analysis. So that would be the load forecast. Are you using a 1 in 2, a 1 in 5, a 1 in 10? The resource counting. What are resources counting and how are the resources counting? And in terms of making sure that essentially the amount of resources that are procured are able to meet the need. That then, once those are established to some degree, then you can go into the LOLE analysis, which will look at sort of the capabilities of the resources to be able to meet load to calculate LOLE, and then an adjustment based on the PRM from that through the iterative process I described earlier.
And the Brent from SE, I agree. Locking down the load forecast used, the reliability criteria, and resource counting are all required before you can embark on that LOLE, develop the monthly PRMs. So does that help, Noah?
Yeah, no, I think it's helpful. I was waiting to see if Carrie was going to respond as well, in her mind what it might end up.
Oh, yep, nope, I agree. You need the framework nailed down before you start doing the specific studies. I do think actually we could do some additional work, especially if we go down the 24-hour proposal. I think there are ways we could advance the proposal a little further before bringing it to the CPUC. Likewise, I think I have a couple outstanding items that we could advance a little further. But I think SCE, actually, we could work on yours more before having the framework determined. But before major studies will need to be done, we need to pick a framework, certainly.
Yeah, thanks. I'm wondering whether or not then sort of this idea of over procurement on the various frameworks is sort of a fact. You know, that it is true that there might be over procurement in one versus the other if we don't know what the planning reserve margin is at the end of the day.
So over procurement for calendar year 2024 in particular?
Well, no, I think the statements of over procurement under a 2-slice proposal versus a 24-slice proposal.
Yeah, I guess from my perspective, it's not at all clear from my perspective that a 2-hour that a 2-slice essentially proposal with the appropriate planning reserve margin and a 24-slice proposal with the appropriate planning reserve margin will get you very much different a portfolio of resources. I mean, it's an empirical question to some degree, and it depends to some degree on how much you're discounting resource counting, particular resource counting, and how much essentially you're looking at what the target is that you're trying to set. Target that you're trying to set to some degree depends upon, certainly it's a 1 in 10 or something that the commission, a level of reliability the commission needs to determine. But then are you looking at a 1 in 2? Are you looking at a 1 in 5? Are you looking at a 1 in 10 load forecast? Those will all have an impact to some degree on the amount of resources you'll need to be able to meet those requirements. And essentially, you know, that will also then in turn have an impact on the planning reserve margin. So you know, there will be some variation, I think, across the methodologies. It's an empirical question in my mind as to whether or not that leads to more or less procurement under a particular structure.
I have a little bit different of a take, Peter. So in my mind, the over procurement differences between the proposals isn't to do with the slices or the even counting or requirement. I think the fundamental difference is whether you have an aggregate shape that you're procuring to or an LSC specific shape. And where I see the potential for over procurement being greater is when you have the LSC specific shape and you're procuring to all 24 hours, because you can only take into account the resource diversity benefits within an LSC portfolio and not between them. So I think some of the discussion around over procurement that at least I was saying has to do with the between LSC portfolio resource benefits and not to do with whether you know, we're doing the counting or requirements in a similar way.
You know, and I'd argue that right now, again, the reason we're here is we're under procuring because the portfolios that we're bringing are not bringing reliability. And the key is not to over or under procure, it's to bring a portfolio that we're confident brings reliability. And you see very well, you may very well, and I would actually expect you'd have a different portfolio under the 24-hour slice than a 2-point, because under a 24-hour slice, you know you're bringing reliability in all hours, and you know you're bringing enough capacity to charge your batteries. In a 2-slice, you don't know either of those things.
So I would define over procurement as an aggregate, us procuring and paying for more RA than we need in system aggregate. I don't think over procurement has to do with meeting a target. I would agree with you right now that our requirement has too low of a planning reserve margin, and we just don't have enough capacity being procured through our RA framework today. But I don't think that's a function of over procurement. Over procurement is we have universally agreed to this target overall, and now we have procured RA above that.
So I'm not sure that I can let you agree with something because I meant something different. I don't know if our planning reserve margin is too low today. Our portfolios that we are bringing to the market are not correct. And yeah, you can always jack your planning reserve margin high enough so eventually you get a portfolio that is correct. But I would not blame it on the planning reserve margin. I would blame it on a single point estimate that's not reflecting a portfolio that can serve load throughout the day.
Well, I mean, when I say our planning reserve margins are too low today, I'm talking about today's paradigm where they account for a certain amount of load, uncertainty, and forced outages. And as demonstrated by the blackouts, we don't have a high enough planning reserve margin to account for existing outages. So that's what I mean by it's not high enough, just under today's paradigm.
Yes, yes.
Okay. So I see Doug Carpa, you have your hand up.
Yeah, just making sure it's lowered again. Yeah, and I put this in the chat also. I get a strong sense that diversity benefit is really that is a term or a factor that only exists if you're calculating ELCCs in terms of the amount of reliability that you get over and above what you get that is individually attributable to each resource as a consequence of the interaction between them. But if you unpack that, a lot of that interaction happens, for example, like storage takes on greater benefit if you have a lot of solar to charge it, and it has to do with the patterns of discharge of different kinds of resources relative to each other. But if you are tracking that in a 24-hour system, you are like expressly and explicitly laying out exactly what resources are discharging in what hours. And so that interplay between different resource types, that's expressly captured in a 24-slice system. So I don't think it's entirely on the money to say that like there's a diversity benefit we capture in ELCC that we don't capture in a 24-slice system, because I mean diversity benefits are a fudge factor that only exists in an ELCC system.
So just a little finer point on what you're saying, Doug. So I agree with you that a 24-hour slice, right? If we had one LSE, if it was just SCE procuring, right, then the resource diversity benefits would be fully captured. Not capturing the resource diversity benefits is an artifact of having a load, an LSE specific 24-hour profile. As soon as you say that each hour has to be procured individually by LSE, you now no longer capture resource diversity benefits between LSEs. And that's an important point, because when we had 3 IOUs, right, you can think about it, 3 IOUs, yeah, you can kind of average out the wind and solar with just these 3 IOUs on the system. Procuring whatever resources exist in that local area. So the idea that we could just kind of transfer these obligations or capture the resource diversity benefits within each individual load just doesn't exist under our LSE construct today.
I'll have to take a look at that, because I suspect that a lot of that does get captured because the system, particularly if the system load has to add up to, or the individual LSE loads have to add up to the system.
So I think I know people suspect that's true, but I encourage you to just do a simple experiment and just take 10 LSEs, right? And just have one that's predominantly solar based and one that's predominantly wind based, match them up and see what the over procurement is. And then think what happens if that's done with 76 load serving entities. And then backing up just a little bit, this is resource diversity benefits are quantifiable, because when ISOs decide to become ISOs, they do studies that say, what is the benefit of us doing aggregate procurement? And one of the greatest benefits to aggregate procurement are the load and resource diversity benefits. That's one of the biggest points of joining an ISO.
Yeah. So I agree on energy side. So energy dispatch, huge benefits to optimize energy dispatch within an ISO or RTO.
I'm on capacity though, Brent. So when you join an ISO,
I don't see it.
you get.
I'm not seeing it though. I'm not seeing
I know you're not seeing it, but I think you're not seeing it because you're SCE. And if you need to balance your portfolio by going and getting more solar, you can. But smaller LSEs can't do that.
But
you get that, right?
But Carrie, you're assuming that you're allowing. Go ahead,
Sorry.
Doug.
Yeah. Maybe I should let you finish up, because that is sort of secondary point. Yeah. So Peter, why don't you go ahead and I'll
No, to Carrie, to what degree are you relying on the LSEs that have different shapes to rely on the same resources to meet their peaks?
I'm sorry, Peter, I don't understand the question. If you're
Well,
an
you're talking-
LSE, you can't rely on the same resource to meet. I mean, you
Well,
can't
but
double
you're-
count
but
capacity. What are you saying?
I don't understand what your diversity benefit is, because I thought your diversity was on the load side that you were pointing to.
No, so you have portfolio
So-
benefits and you have
well-
load benefits. Wait, Peter, you asked me a question, I'm answering. You have load benefits and then you have resource diversity benefits. I think you could allocate load diversity benefits fairly simply. I cannot think of how to allocate resource diversity benefits on a 24-hour proposal. If I could,
Okay,
I would have proposed.
No, I guess, Carrie, from my perspective, having the ability to use storage in ways that provides a lot of flexibility for LSEs. The LSEs are, and again, we haven't talked about this in terms of what the requirements are on how to use storage, and in particular in the showing. If I've got a 50 megawatt storage resource and I can sell to, or 70 megawatt storage resource, and I can sell to, 70 different LSEs, 1 megawatt. Now, is there going to be a requirement on each LSE to use the same shape? Or are we allowing essentially the LSEs to determine what the shape is, that how they want to use that storage that they're procuring to be able to meet their load? Because that is one way, to some degree, if you allow the latter, that is one way essentially to be able to get some diversity benefit across resources, because you're allowing a particular type of resource, namely storage, to be able to move load around in a way that is helpful. Now, we haven't talked about whether or not, from an operational standpoint, I don't think the ISO wants to see, 70 different ways that, and 70 different ways that the counting is going to take place necessarily for on a resource basis. But it is not, it's a topic, and whether that should be something that we take into account has not yet been discussed. I think to some degree, we have to think about whether or not that diversity can take place through the way that we're looking at this. So let me just stop there.
Yep, I agree that certainly if we go down the 24-hour proposal, one of the only ways to capture any of the resource diversity benefits will be to take a good look at what you're talking about. I also, though, don't think you're going to find a 70 megawatt storage who's going to sign 71 megawatt contracts. And I think that's part of the issue, right? When you get into these smaller load serving entities, procuring the exact megawatt amount you need for a specific hour is what leads to over procurement. And I get it doesn't if you're PG&E. And I'm not claiming that PG&E will have that problem, but I'm telling you that small LSEs already have, I think, what did Greg Clack call it? Clumpiness. And that when you do hourly, it only enhances the clumpiness of procurement, which naturally leads to over procurement. That's my only point.
I guess, Carrie, to some degree, there could easily be business opportunities for resources to be able to slice and dice in that way. Now, if you're saying that they will be paying, smaller LSEs would be paying more for that than larger LSEs, you're pointing to the fact that there are scale economies in the transactions and in this. And yes, that is a fact. That's a fact of what we're dealing with. Should the program that we're setting up try and get rid of those scale economies and make it more even, or should they be recognized and allow for smaller transactions essentially to have to pay for more than larger transactions? That's a fundamental economic question.
It is. And I think by scale economies, you have it two ways. Right now, like already you're bigger and it's cheaper to buy a larger asset. But then two, you're bigger and it's easier to shape your portfolio because you do more procurement. So to me, this is actually doubling down on the scale economies for larger LSEs. But you're right, it is
but scale economies are a fact of the economics. I mean, it's like trying to change gravity.
Okay, I think maybe we can.
I had a second.
Move on.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, my second concern, and I haven't entirely convince myself this is a genuine problem, but I'm pretty sure it is. One of the other big interactions in an ELCC system is that the value of the resources that we have depends on what everybody else is doing. And so PCE, let's take us as an example, we're moving towards 100% renewable in all hours, 24/7, right? So that's going to be a lot of renewables and then a big chunk of storage. The value, particularly of storage, depends very, very strongly on how much gas everyone else has. And so we could like buy a chunk of storage, big long contracts, and it has a certain value today, but then as the resource mix of other entities changes, that value will go down and then it should come back up. And even though we would be in a position where we can meet our own load in every hour, we are having no net impact on the reliability of the system. Like we are, let's say hypothetically, really like every single hour we cover our load. We are still going to go out and have to buy gas resources contracts in addition to what we're already doing because of the ELCC value of our resources are getting eroded by other entities. And so essentially we have to buy additional resources just for RIA compliance, even though we are not having a impact on the system, whereas other entities, because they're getting essentially over credit, in my view, for their resources, will end up buying relatively less compared to their impact on the system, which the diversity benefit, like how it gets moved around, actually is going to benefit some LSEs and hurt others, I think, because of this. And it also creates a bit of a load shifting problem. And for us, it'd be an over procurement problem. So there may be not over procurement on a global scale, but at an LSE by LSE basis, some of us are just, because of the way the rules work, are going to have to buy more than we need, and others will not have to do that. So that's a concern I'm trying to wrap my head around, but
yeah, I am. So yeah, a lot to unpack there, but here's what I would maybe encourage you to do, is to think separately about your capacity requirements and your energy requirements. And PCE's 24 renewable energy goal is separate from the capacity you're going to need to show to maintain reliability. Well, so first, you have to, but no. Yeah, I get that's your point, but I think you need to think a little bit more about those concepts and ensuring reliability versus meeting an energy renewable goal, because those are two different constraints and two different targets, and those are priced differently. And then two, when you think about resource diversity benefits and how storage will degrade over time, I would also separate out resource diversity benefits from storage degrading over time. Two different concepts, think about them independently. Now, very specifically on will your storage degrade over time? Yes, under both proposals, because as we move forward, 4-hour storage is going to be worth less for grid reliability. We're going to get to a point where 4-hour storage is going to saturate the peak. And if we keep buying more 4-hour storage, it's going to be worth less to grid reliability. Under SCE's proposal, under my proposal, anyway, that is going to happen. And so the critical piece in my mind is how do we value that 4-hour storage relative to different technologies? And SCE says we're going to give it the same RA transaction value. Say it's 100 megawatt, a 4-hour storage will be 100 megawatts, an 8-hour storage will be 100 megawatts. You're going to have a price for that RA, but SCE will allow you to show it in 8 sections or more sections, let's say more hours, right? And I'm saying no, 4-hour storage, I'm going to discount that 100 megawatts. So it's only worth, let's say 70 megawatts of RA, and 8-hour is worth 95 megawatts. Because that's the relative contribution to the grid overall. In both ways, you're quantifying the differences in technologies. I'm just doing it directly in the RA value versus putting it and showings in different buckets. I hope that helps, Doug. I'm very happy to talk to you more about this offline.
Yeah, well, we will tomorrow.
Yeah, we'll talk tomorrow. Yep.
Okay, well, next up is me. So what I was going to ask about was on that supply portfolio diversity benefit issue, but I think we may have talked about that enough. I I guess I'm beginning to conclude that if you are using a 24 hourly shape compliant system and the exceedance values, assuming that you are appropriately grouping your wind and solar resources into appropriate maybe geographic regions for their different generation profiles, that the sum of those individual will add up to the total anyway, as long as they are treated similarly to load, where you're pegging the load requirement to the coincident CAISO peak. Similarly, you would be looking at the generation profiles on those forced days, and maybe then that just obviates the need to try to separately calculate some diversity benefit. But then Doug raised this point about the fact that PGE, when it procures storage now, that the value of that might degrade when you're using ELCC. That's true when you're using average ELCC for all resources in perpetuity, because average ELCCs for variable resources in storage will change. But I think that that's more of an argument for vintaging the ELCC, the incremental ELCC value for some period of time, which is something I would be interested in having the group discuss in a little bit more detail. I'm not sure when, but just how to deal with the differences between the need to show reliability in the near term with the fleet of resources that you have versus properly incentivizing LSCs going forward to procure the resources based on the contributions they make on the margin. And that's the E3 paper that I mentioned discusses some different ways of dealing with that. And one of those is this concept of vintaged incremental ELCC. So just something to think about. Okay, so let me just see. Nick was next in line, but he had sent a message saying that he needed to step away. Nick, are you there?
Hey, Scott, I'm back actually. Thank you.
Okay. All right.
Hey, so I wanted to come back to a question I asked in the chat, and Carrie, you made a comment in your presentation that conjured me up, so I figured I'd act on it around MCC. So the question I have, it's more of a discussion, I think, is it seems like a central offering from your proposal is around efficiency that you get from allowing LSEs to essentially, let's say you have one wind heavy LSE, one solar heavy LSE, rather than forcing them each to transact, they get sort of the equivalent benefit on a system scale. And what I want to dig into a little bit is this question around leaning and whether that's a policy structure we have to worry about. So as I've worked through this, I've been operating under the assumption that leaning and preventing leaning is a longstanding principle of the commission. It's effectively the rationale for our MCC buckets. And I've sensed that it may be unlikely that the commission might adopt something that essentially removes the MCC bucket leaning prevention without an alternative. And I just want to understand that a little bit better. It sounds like you're saying we'll get economies of scale and efficiency from removing the leaning handcuffs, but I want to sort of understand how that fits in the overarching commission direction and concerns around leaning, which exists in the current shaping of the RA portfolios with the MCC buckets. So am I understanding that right? And can you talk through kind of the logic of the policy approach there?
I mean, I'm not sure this is a great question for me. I don't see anything that defines leaning as LSCs taking advantage of natural load and resource diversity benefits. I do see leaning being really prohibited and discouraged by the CPUC, and that some LSCs for a long time have been short and others have been long, and the short LSCs basically have been leaning on the long ones. But again, this is not whether CPUC is preventing this. I can't find any specific thing in the record, Nick. I looked after our conversation, but I can't claim any particular expertise on CPUC leaning policy.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful, and I think we're all in the same boat where it's sort of a question for the policymakers, and I'm not going to ask, put the CPUC folks on the spot here, but I think understanding whether leaning and shaping RA portfolios is a meaningful goal of this process is important, might guide our understanding of kind of what are the options on the table.
Okay, that was all from you, Nick. Then next we have Sergio.
have two questions. The first one is one I wrote in the chat and during Carrie's presentation, and I apologize if you answered later on. My chat also glitched for a moment. But in your presentation, there's this mention of a term, deliverable nameplate, in an example offered to contrast storage with a fossil asset. Could you elaborate on that terminology? Are you relating that to deliverability or to the availability of a resource?
Oh goodness, I honestly don't even remember where that is in my presentation.
It's on slide 10 of your presentation.
Slide 10, thank you. So deliverable, to me, I'm talking about capacity, and I'm talking about the CAISO's deliverability studies. But I apologize. Let me go look at that slide after this, and I'll shoot you a note on what I meant.
Okay. And another question I had is, it seems to me that a lot of Gridwell's arguments in favor of having two slices, and so far really has been about this idea of the potential for over procuring by not accounting the diversity benefits of all the LSCs sort of coming together under this program. And I was wondering, from my perspective, something I've worried with just having two slices is the potential for over procuring, really, period, anything based on the fact that we're going to be, counting resources in a much less granular way. So my main question here is, is there any way or back of the envelope way even that you could estimate which of these would be greater, or that you could demonstrate it at least? Because I think that could give a lot of insight to parties that are not on the showing side of the RA program. Yeah.
So first of all, I think it's funny that that's coming out as one of the biggest benefits of the proposal. I don't think that's one of the biggest benefits. I think that's a benefit that exists today. Yeah, that needs to be preserved. I just want to say, I'm proposing this because it's transactable. It's transactable by a large number of buyers and sellers. And I don't think a 24-hour slice proposal yields a transactable product. I think it's going to be a headache for everyone for the next decade if we go down that road. I think as a consultant, I'm going to be explaining this for the next 10 years if we go down the 24-hour slice. So the benefits is resource diversity, sure, but yielding a transactable, understandable product is really the goal. And then two, whether we could estimate it, we could. It would take a lot of work, right? It's something that I have thought about doing for these presentations, but it's just a labor-intensive process. I certainly hope someone does it. But I have no capability. To be really frank, I am paid to follow these meetings. I am not paid to present. I am presenting because Gridwell has certain beliefs as a company, and I'm representing them, but no one's paying me to do this extra effort. So it just took too long for me to justify putting the numbers together myself. But I really hope someone does and agree that it would be beneficial to all parties.
Yeah, I would, just to close that idea out, I would support that the people behind the two slice proposal that supported it in the survey tried to put some information to that regard out there. I think SCE did a very compelling job in the first part of the structural elements presentations, showing us like, hey, the longer your slices are, you're gonna buy more and more, and that's against the interest of ratepayers and not representative of any load shape, either an aggregate one or the LSC's one. You're still over procuring just by looking at a single data point, or a single data point across a number of hours. And something to contrast those would be valuable, and it's something that unfortunately we haven't seen from the two slice proposal, more than just conceptually. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I have to tell you though, I don't actually think that analysis was compelling. Why not move to 5-minute slices then, right? Like you account for the resources, you set your requirement, and then you figure out what the grid needs. Just having smaller slices, it's easier. I certainly support it above PG&E's policy, but that doesn't get at the over procurement or the efficiency of today's structure versus 24/7. So I don't think I could just easily compare them like that. Like you would actually have to put in different load profiles, stack them up, and then compare it against stacked profiles against a 2-slice and make a lot of assumptions. So if it was as easy as you're saying, I would have done it, but unfortunately it's not.
Okay, it looks like Brent, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so this question's for Carrie and maybe the group. So I'm still so you know the actual merits of the proposal aside, I'm not seeing how the 2-slice proposal actually meets the commission's guidance in the decision. In particular, the discussion of why the PG&E the slice a day proposal was chosen initially. So where is this actually? Page 37 of the decision. Actually, read. So in particular, I'll paraphrase. In particular, the commission liked that the 24 slice proposal covers the hourly needs, like the specific hourly needs across an example day. SE had a proposal that was hourly as well. So the monthly net load, like it was like a monthly hourly net. And the commission specifically chose the PG&E proposal because it covers a single day, shows energy sufficiency across the day, and liked the idea of to use exceedance on an hourly basis as the best estimate of the contribution of resources. So I'm not seeing how like 2 points in the day do the same things. The commission has recognized the current system, the single monthly ELCC, doesn't do what they need to do. MCC buckets don't do what they need to do. I'm not seeing how the 2-point system with no MCC buckets actually gets the commission what they've asked for, what they want. And
yeah.
How, yeah.
You've mentioned this a bunch of times, but I'm going to try and answer again. Maybe I'm doing a bad job, but so let's go back 10 years ago. We still had a peak capacity requirement and we had hourly energy sufficiency. No one is ever making the argument that 10 years ago, if we procured to our peak, we didn't have hourly energy sufficiency. That is a very typical capacity construct. Now we've evolved to have renewables, and the counting rules have changed to the point that sometimes we have a single target and the counting rules overcount certain resource types. And so we had blackouts, right? We in particular had blackouts by what the CPUC said in their decision during hours where renewable resources aren't available, but the load is still high. Hourly energy sufficiency only matters really in terms of capacity where you are at risk of loss of load. So the way Gridwell's proposal ensures hourly energy sufficiency is it takes the 2 points where you're most likely to have a loss of load expectation, and it ensures that your counting rules and your requirement align to a 1 in 10 LOE during those most constrained points. And so you ensure hourly energy sufficiency, just like we have across the country, across the world under a standard capacity construct. And yes, we've added a point, but I would argue that analytically that may not even be needed because of how you're adjusting things on the counting rule side. So hourly energy sufficiency does not translate in my mind to an hourly requirement. That is a simplistic translation. And so I haven't tried to incorporate that into a proposal because I think that's unnecessary, both with, and I understand there's a lot of like heartburn about using ELCC, and I think that's a con of my proposal. I think ELCC is more modern capacity theory and it's not well understood, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't ensure hourly energy sufficiency. It's just a different way to do it.
So, okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, well, no one else has their hand raised. Are there any other final questions? All right, and would any of the presenters like to make any concluding? Oh, sorry, it looks like Bridget just put her hand up. Bridget, why don't you go ahead?
Thanks. Yeah, I just kind of wanted to, before we kind of all sign off, get the group thinking about kind of next steps and like where we go from here. Because it seems like, you know, we're starting to narrow down between, you know, we had 3 proposals, now we have 2. You know, what do we think are kind of the next steps of either getting it down to 1, or do we decide to take the 2 proposals to the commission and let them decide kind of where parties are thinking we should take this discussion now that we kind of have frameworks fleshed out? And you know, do we think it's feasible right now to have the working group report done in February, or are we at a point where we maybe start asking for more time?
Yeah, I guess I'll take a stab at answering that. I mean, the report, depending on the extent to which all the parties come to general consensus on frameworks, resource counting, et cetera, I mean, the workshop report will either reflect that or it will reflect divergence of opinion. And if those opinions are fairly evenly divided, then I suppose, you know, what you're characterizing as presenting 2 proposals is in effect what would happen. There was never any guarantee that all parties would reach 100% or even 90% consensus. So I don't think that that's necessarily a realistic goal. But it would be nice. I mean, that said, to the extent that we get to 90+% agreement on especially the core elements of the framework, I think that's desirable. And if we need more time to talk about it, then it wouldn't hurt, as Carrie, I think, suggested in the chat, to set up more time to do that. Let's see, Barbara, you have your hand up.
Yes, I do. I think I think if we could reach a consensus, that would be great. But I also know that the commission has asked for something in a certain time frame in order to reach a decision that then can be implemented in 2024. So I think it might be, if before anybody asks for more time, I think it would be important for people to reach out to the commission and find out what their preference would be. You know, because if we get, I mean, I think it looks like we might be converging on at least some agreement on some points, but I don't think that, I mean, my reaction to the commission's decision, and this is just my interpretation, is that it has a certain time frame in mind for reaching a decision, and that it's not going to let this go on for another year because of the concern that the RA framework is already broken. So I think it would be useful to, before anybody goes and asks for more time, is to find out what the commission would rather have.
Yeah, and I would imagine there needs to be another process step at some point, with the commission issuing a ruling after the submission of the workshop report, maybe in accompanying with the workshop report attached, and then asking parties to provide comments on various questions. So, you know, and if the workshop report doesn't demonstrate that parties were able to agree, then the commission will be in the position of having to do what it's supposed to do, which is to make tough decisions and figure out a way forward. All right, any other comments? Okay, well, I think at this point, probably the co-facilitators should schedule time to talk again soon and think about next steps. We have some meetings scheduled between now through the final workshop date and after that to talk about how to get the workshop report done. So there are some of those process step checks along the way that we have committed ourselves to. But any thoughts that any other parties on the call have, feel free to share them with me, with PG&E, and with any of the other facilitators. But it is encouraging, I think, based on today's conversation and the results of the survey, that there is a large degree of convergence. And frankly, I think even though there's kind of a fork in the road between the proposal that Carrie's putting forward and where PG&E and SCE have usually landed, I think either of them are workable. And in my mind, the big advantages, the pros and cons, are really for the LSEs. It's the LSEs that need to be able to transact, that need to be able to comply, the PUC staff that needs to review those compliance filings, and it needs to be consistent with CAISO processes. So in my mind, those are the parties that in some ways have a bit more weight in determining what the final recommendations might be. Because I think the producers and the sellers, if we're selling a bundled product, what happens to that bundled product afterwards is a little bit less important to us. Then it's out of our hands. All right, any other comments or questions? If not, we can wrap up a little bit early and give people some time back.
Scott, thanks for your help today. I would just reiterate the storage meeting, and if everyone has the invite on their calendar for Friday.
Yeah, I saw it come through and I have it on my calendar.
Will presentations be distributed before the workshop?
This is Lisa. I'm meeting with the co-facilitators tomorrow to distribute the presentations.
Thank you, Lisa.
No problem.
Right, yeah, thanks. Okay, well then let's wrap it up and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thanks, everyone.